Hola, ¿cómo están? Mi nombre es Magali Urquiza, soy directora de la unidad de biotecnología de la consultora GB. Estamos en esta oportunidad con Jason Rhodes, partner en Atlas Ventures. Ciao, Jason. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, good, great, great. Dealing with winter. I'm happy to know you're in summertime, so great.
Great. Great.
Well, Jason, what can you tell me about the biotech world in these days? How it's been going? Can you provide us a big picture about it?
So when we talk about biotech, we're usually talking about early stage companies that we think of as startups that are creating new therapeutic medicines and usually using sort of the latest, most advanced technology. So they're part of the broader biopharmaceutical world, but they're very different than the large pharmaceutical companies that we think about, like Roche and Novartis and Pfizer and Sanofi and companies like that. And of course, there are biotechs all over the world. And science for new biotechs really does come from often academic institutions and scientific entrepreneurs all over the world. But that said, the biotech industry is concentrated in certain spaces like Boston and San Francisco, but also in other places. And it really is possible to start biotechs all around the world. And so the biotech industry is in a great place, and it's in a great place because of the fundamental advances that have occurred in science over the past couple of decades. And those advances fall into at least two categories that I think of. One is new insights into biology and what causes disease. And then secondly, what we call the therapeutic modalities, the kind of product platforms that we can use to make drugs. And so once upon a time, we only had small molecules that are the pills that you take, or we had proteins that you might inject, like insulin, and we still have those things. But of course, now we have cell therapy and gene editing with things like CRISPR, and oligonucleotides and RNAi knockdown and all of these things. So we know an awful lot about science, and we've got a whole toolkit that we can use to make new products. And so those are the fundamental drivers of the industries. It's advance of the industry. It's these advances in the science and technology, and those are very strong. And then what's interesting about our business is that products eventually go off patent, which is a very strange thing. No one thinks about the iPhone going off patent. Like one day it's $1,000 for an iPhone and the next day it's $75. That doesn't happen. But it does happen actually in the pharmaceutical industry, which is sort of a strange and slightly incredible thing. You have a drug that's selling for whatever it's selling for. And then after a certain period of time, the life of the patents for that drug, it goes off patent, and then the sales collapse. But the sales collapse not because no one's buying the drug. In fact, the volume, the consumption of the drug might actually increase, but because price has collapsed. And so for the big companies in the space, that's a real challenge because they're constantly losing product sales. And before they can even think about how they grow their business, they have to sort of fill the sales that are going away. So it's tough for the big companies, but it's very good in this sense for the companies that are the sources of innovation, the biotech, because there's constant demand from the large companies for innovation that mainly comes from small companies. So for all of those reasons, it's a very good time to be in biotech.
Yeah, it's always a good time. I'm not objective in, in that part, but because first, thank you for your time, Jason, for this interview. I'm already happy because the first interview for in terms of biotech, like strictly about biotech. So happy to talk to hear about the most loving sector. But there has been like a couple of items also in the sector or in our industry related to the challenges we have seen like throughout the past years, like a huge drop or a very important like huge drop in value. What would the reasons would you say that caused this huge drop?
Yeah, so I think you have to look back a few years, and clearly the overall biotech space, like technology more broadly, was very overbought and overvalued in that sort of 20 and 21 period. And then kind of coming through that, we then had an increase in inflation globally and certainly in the US. And then in response to that, interest rates increased. And in general, that brought down valuations for kind of high tech, high growth companies. And so that was kind of a big change in the macro setting that did play through for biotech. But that's sort of that's a cyclical trend. It's real, but it's cyclical, and it's happening in parallel with these fundamental structural or secular drivers that I was talking about. And so while maybe the average biotech company was highly valued, and there are many biotechs, particularly those that are preclinical, that don't yet have clinical data, that remain undervalued. I think what we've seen in both the public markets and the private markets is that promising companies, and in particular those that do have clinical data, are very, very highly valued. So I think it's very hard also to make kind of a broad brush statement about the industry. The reality is that product-oriented companies in general are still well valued and well funded, and that as they generate clinical data, we see that clinical data valued both in the public markets in terms of their valuations and also in the M&A market. And so it's been a very, very active M&A market. And the reason for that is that large pharmaceutical companies will have about $200 billion in sales go off patent over the next 4 to 5 years. And so that's that hole that we were talking about before that they have to fill. And so that's the reality of it. Regardless of where the public markets are valuing things or not, the big pharma companies have to fill that $200 billion hole. And so that's driving demand for new innovation and driving demand for M&A from them. So the thing I always think about is the stock market is cyclical and biotech is cyclical. And small caps, emerging growth companies are very volatile, and biotech is volatile. And it's really important to understand cyclicality and volatility, but to not draw conclusions about the fundamental nature of the industry or its potential based on cyclicality and volatility. If someone says prices have come down and they were very high, that's important to know because it affects your financing strategy. But what it tells you is about where you are in the cycle. It doesn't tell you really anything about the future prospects for the industry. So that distinction is very important, I think.
Yes, it's critical. And one of the topics I usually discuss with my friends that are most of them like tech funds is tech funds. Like, what's the risk of tech, like the tech industry taking over biotech? We have seen like a lot of deployment in terms of AI, and back in the days it was like drug development platforms with like super high tech tools and so on, like trying to be more involved in the biotech world. In this particular case, considering the differences in terms of economics in both industries, what would you say is the risk of one taking over another one?
Yeah, so I think what I would say is that biotech innovation and the companies that are pursuing it use a tremendous amount of technology. It is a very technology intensive industry, and it has been for a very long time. And in some ways, it's kind of a tech perspective to say, well, AI is new, and so now we're going to bring technology into biotech. Biotech has always been very technology intensive, using lots of different technologies, X-ray crystallography and protein imaging and cellular imaging. And it's also been very computationally intensive. So we think about using computational chemistry for a very long time. We've had some very successful companies like Nimbus that were basically based on computational chemistry. So in that sense, there's actually nothing new about tech in biotech. It's kind of a headline view of the world, I think,
The buzzword
for someone
of the moment.
for someone to say, gosh, AI is so big and it's going to change everything. Well, biotech has always been technology intensive. It will continue to be technology intensive, and I'm sure we'll use AI. I think it's also important to understand what the different sort of activities are in the value chain where these technologies are applied. So for example, we've thought a lot about machine learning, which is what we used to call AI, but also AI being very useful to think about clinical trial design. Which patients should we include in the trial? Because you want to include patients who are responders. You don't want to dilute the patients with non-responders. And so things like machine learning and AI should be very helpful in helping us to identify which patients to include. Also, maybe trial design, which endpoints to pursue with a given patient population. I think AI will be enormously helpful for healthcare access, because you should be able to have a diagnostic conversation with an AI bot, at least for certain things, right? Um, whether it's before you go in to see your physician or maybe it's afterwards when you need to follow up on things. For fundamental molecular discovery, that is a kind of multimodal problem, as I was saying before, that we already use many technologies for, and things like AI may probably will play a role in it. But again, I think it's kind of a front cover of The Economist kind of view of the world for people to think, well, all of a sudden this thing's going to come along that fundamentally changes the nature of molecular discovery and the biotech industry. That doesn't seem very likely to me, but I guess we'll find out.
We'll find out. Time will tell. But and well, one last questions. I know you're in a hurry. Based on the current like drivers and fundamentals in biotech, what do you see the niches that are more likely to have more news in the short term, at least, or midterm?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's tremendous unmet need in terms of human disease and health. And while a lot of the emphasis over the past decade, for example, has been on rare diseases and oncology because of fundamental advances that were made in genetics and molecular biology and things like that, and there will continue to be real advances in rare diseases and oncology, we can also, make the observation that there's tremendous advances happening right now in immunity and autoimmune diseases. And then a lot of the kinds of technologies, antibodies, and other things that we use in areas like cancer are now being applied in autoimmunity. And then what's very interesting is the emergence of these medicines that treat obesity, the GLP-1s, and there's a whole set of other things. And I think for many years, the pharma industry had chosen not to pursue these very large indications. But I think the lesson that you can take away is that once there's a technology and a product solution, that the industry is very, very good at focusing and applying tremendous resources to create new drugs. And so obesity is an example of that. And I think we're just at the very beginning of a wave of products for metabolic disease.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. It was a pleasure to have you, and I couldn't agree more in terms of AI and all the new buzzwords and trending words coming out. So yes.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the chance to talk to you.
No, thanks to you, and well, espero que hayan disfrutado esta entrevista y nos vemos en la próxima entrevista sobre biotecnología. Mi nombre es Magali Urquiza y nos estaremos viendo por acá por WhatsApp.